Yes, good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for the opportunity to present this paper titled Election, Ethics and Missio-dei, a Biblical Theology of Life and Transformative Leadership in the context of COVID-19. But of course, it is important for me to indicate that the context has changed. At the time when I submitted this proposal for this presentation, we were under COVID-19 lockdown. And I do want to indicate that in South Africa, things have changed rapidly with regards to COVID-19 because we are back to what others would call the new normal. In most instances, life has become what it used to be, although there are still some precautions that we have to take regarding COVID-19. It is important also to highlight that this is not a biblical exegetical study, but it is grounded on missional ecclesiology, and I employ what is called the social systems theory to engage with the situation of what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I like about the social systems theory is that it conceptualizes the managing of human resources as a social process, which lays the foundation to overcome the individualistic perspectives or approaches that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic response. There was a lot of individualized responses, whether it had to do with tenders that were available for those who are politically connected, or whether it had to do with individual nations hoarding vaccines. There was a tendency to be individualistic when people were approaching the response to the pandemic. And I'm critical of this approach, engaging with what was happening within the church space through the concept of missional ecclesiology, which in some way is simply to approach the mission of God as the sending of the Spirit to redeem and transform creation towards life for all. I will, in this paper, be critically engaging with those issues with regards to the responses to COVID-19, with a view to making recommendations for future responses to the pandemics or crisis, so that our leadership does not always have to be individualistic. One of the key scholars in this presentation is Christopher Wright, who talks about a theology or a biblical theology of life, where he talks about the people of God as a people who walk in God's way. And he reflects in the history of God's saving work, which began through the call of Abraham and the promise to his descendants of how through Abraham we will be blessed. And the many dimensions of that, especially as he unpacks Genesis 18, verse 19. And they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he had spoken of him. And in this verse, you will see that Wright's theology of life draws together the following aspects. My apologies for a typing error there for the word aspect. But one, it is the God's choice of Abraham, which I call in this presentation election. And by election, I extend this concept to even election of office bearers in public office. And the second aspect is God's moral demand on Abraham's community, the ethical dimension of that election, whether it is the election as a royal priesthood, in other words, as the followers of Christ. There is an ethical dimension to it. People are expected to live in a particular way. And lastly, God's promise to Abraham and how the nations will be blessed through him. That speaks to the mission of God, how it is like to be a blessing because God has blessed us. And therefore, when you look at election, ethics, and mission, whether it is starting with mission, ethics, and election, vice versa, you will see that ethics is at the center of these integrally linked aspects of a biblical theology of life. In other words, there is the centrality of our moral or ethical expectation on us when we're elected into public office, and more so when we're engaging in God's mission as a people called by God. And the summary key points in this presentation, of course, is a critical analysis of how the poor were taken advantage of, or they continue to be abused, especially the vulnerable women and children. And in particular, I developed some of the work that I've done through the publications and the research which I did during the COVID-19 peak, where I looked at the government responses. And from the South African perspective, I called that a dilemma in one of my publications, because when the government was even responding, they kept talking about engaging with key stakeholders, and they talk about the church, while in actual fact, they were talking about a selected representative of the church. It was as if they are engaging the entire church. But in this publication, my emphasis is that the church was actually on the margins of society because the churches were on lockdown. But the government was engaging a few individuals who sometimes were furthering their own interest. And I'm critical about those that were calling for the churches to be open during the pandemic, because some of us knew that it had nothing to do about the church coming together, than it had to do about the financial resources that were being depleted when people were not attending church services. And in my critical engagement with that, I was calling on the government to say they should have been very critical of how churches have been exploiting the poor financially. And now that the pandemic had struck, God had moved the church from what we are used to in the public forum to what I call the church from the margins, and not the church as it used to be, where we minister to the margins. And there was a shift in mission of the church, and some were even wondering if the church is still there. And we had to emphasize that the church is actually not buildings, but the church are the people of God, who at that time were worshiping as families, where the ministry or mission should be taking place all the time, and not only on Sundays in public worship spaces. And there were a lot of injustices. If you talk, for example, about the lockdowns and how migrant laborers were affected, even when the government knows that there are people who survive on informal trade across borders, when the borders were just immediately shut, there was no consideration of who was due to move from which side of the country to the other side as part of their livelihood. And even when they did that, when they distributed food in South Africa here, for example, initially the migrants or foreigners were excluded, and it was the NGOs that had to come in to provide support to non-South Africans. And I talk about political demagoguing as an exploitation of the socio-economic conditions for economic gains, and the corruption that was seen in the tenders. And of course, that is also at the heart of the exploitation of the poor. And these are the critical discussion points that I'll be looking at in this paper and analyzing them through this central verse that places ethics or the moral dimension of those of us elected into office or called into the mission of God, to show the way and to keep justice or righteousness as a pillar of what God has been doing and calls us to do. And in summary, these are the key points that I will be highlighting in this presentation through this missional logic that places the ethical dimension. And if ethics is the middle term between our calling and our mission, whether we're in political office or in church leadership, or we want to talk as Christians, the followers of God who are doing mission, there is an expectation for us to live our daily lives and to make choices and actions and attitudes that reflect a relationship of justice with God through life-affirming values. And in summary, this paper highlights how God's calling has a moral dimension for understanding our election or call. Ethics as a missio-dei and should be understood as transformative leadership for a liberating and life-affirming theology in the context of COVID-19 and other future pandemics, or of course crises that we may experience. And lastly, I quote from the Global Citizen, one of the leaders said, the scale of the global challenges we are facing right now, from the COVID-19 pandemic to gender inequality, from conflict and crisis to climate change, means we cannot afford to wait to make urgent and widespread change to achieve the mission and to end extreme poverty and its systemic causes. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Buhle. And I was thinking, I know that the lockdowns are over, nearly all over the world, but what I've seen in the context of the Netherlands, at least in Europe, is that the effects, I think the biggest effects are only now being felt. And again, it is those in the margins, as far as I can see, who are feeling the effects in terms of jobs or health, long-term health conditions, which affect how they live. So how is the church dealing with that? And I know that you say that the church itself in Southern Africa is in the margin. So I was thinking, how does the church go from that? And does that not put the church always at the mercy of the powerful empire itself? Because the church is it's like it is in the liminal space always, and that's a struggle. Like who do you pay allegiance to? You have to deal with empire to support the people. How do you do that? I think those are the comments that I had. Those are the links that I made in my mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Shingi, for that very important question. And yes, indeed, the effects of COVID-19 are only now being felt, as you profoundly put it. And of course, your question is, how is the church dealing with that? In the second article there that I've posted, Mission on the Margins, a proposal for an alternative missional paradigm in the work of COVID-19. One of the simple things that I'm proposing after COVID is that we should do things differently. For me, it's as simple as all that. In that article, I talk about what I call missional blind spots, to imply that we were so used to doing mission in a way that somehow was traditional and it confused a lot of people. There is a class, finally, a third year theology module that I teach in. And my students got confused when I told them that the church was there. It didn't shut down during COVID-19. What was shut down were places of worship. And we had to debate that statement because for them, the church are those buildings. And I had to explain to them that the church is the people of God and not the buildings. So the missional blind spots that I talk about in this article are the missional activities that normally should be undertaken at community level. But because we have become self-centered as churches and we categorize fellowship with worship and everything within those places of worship, and there's very little that happens in the community. And this has been very disturbing to me, especially to note that they are church leaders. I had to do a simple exercise with the students to say, how many of you in your church know the family that is next door to the church building, to your left or to your right? And there were very few. And those places of worship are inhabited by people who drive from far. The church exists in a community, a local community here, but there is nothing that happens in the community that speaks to the needs of that particular community. They come, they drive cars from far and worship in those spaces, and they go away. The community and the church are completely disconnected. And these are the issues that I'm challenging in this presentation. And in this article, I conclude by actually saying that COVID-19 disruptions through these missional blind spots which I've identified allows for emergence of alternative ways of being church and new modes of socio-economic organization with new possibilities presented through an alternative theoretical hermeneutics of missiology that locates the experiences of the poor at the center. And that is my central argument, that at the center of our mission should be the needs of the poor in our communities, not what happens in our places of worship. So yes, indeed, my final point in responding to your question, how is the church dealing with that, Shingi? Again, my answer is simple. We have to do things differently. We cannot continue to ignore the needs of the people in our communities, in our families. It did not have to take COVID and lockdown for us to know that there's gender-based violence in families that escalated because we had to lock down victims and their abusers. It did not have to be exposed by COVID-19. We knew it. We always prayed with people that come from these homes where there's abuse. They are members of our church, but we have never dared to move from the spaces of worship and go with them to those families to see what is happening. And my last point is, I know there are ministers, for example, who would say, I don't visit my families, I delegate my elders to visit, to do pastoral work. People have mission and ministry or pastoral work for me turned upside down. And COVID-19 gave us an opportunity to reflect on what it is to do ministry and to do mission. And we simply need to go back to what our moderator calls going back to basics. I thank you.